Child Story by Peter Handke. And so the summer ended. In the following winter. Chapter 1. Often, in adolescence, he thought of living with the child later on. He looked forward to an unspoken sense of community, to quickly exchange glances, to sitting down with the child, to irregularly parted hair, to being close together and far apart in a happy unity. The light of this recurrent image was darkening just before the onset of the rain in a courtyard strewn with coarse sand, and bordered with grass, outside a house that was never clearly seen, but only sensed behind his back, under a dense cover of wide-spreading, sporadically murmuring trees. The thought of the child was taken as so much as for granted as his two other great expectations. The woman who he felt sure was destined for him and had long been moving toward him over secret pathways, and the professional life which alone, he held, could offer him the freedom worthy of a human being. But these three yearnings had never once appeared to him together, joined in a single image. On the day when the longed-for child was born, the adult stood in a football field not far from the hospital. It was a bright Sunday morning in spring. In the course of the game, the puddles in the grassless space between the goalposts had been churned into mud, which sent up swirls of vapor. At the hospital, he learned that he was too late. The child had already been born. His wife was rowed past him down the corridor. Her lips was white and dry. The preceding night she had waited alone in the little-used labor room, on a very high rolling bed. When he brought something she had forgotten at home, there was a moment of profound gentleness between them. The man standing in a doorway with the plastic bag, and the woman stretched out on the high metal bed in the middle of the bare room. It's a fairly large room. They are at an unaccustomed distance from each other. On the way from door to bed, the bare linoleum floor gleams in the whitish humming fluorescent light. In the flickering glow as he switched it on, the woman's face had turned to him without surprise or fear. Behind him, it was long after midnight. The spacious, half-darkened corridors and stairways of the building were bathed in an aura of unique and amiable peace, which carried over to the deserted city streets outside. When the child was shown to the adult through the glass partition, what he saw was not a newborn babe, but a complete human being. He was glad when it turned out to be a girl, but as he later realized, his joy would have been the same either way. The creature held out to him behind the glass was not a daughter, let alone progeny, but a child. The man's thought was, it's happy, it's glad to be in the world. The mere fact of being a baby, without the particular characteristics, was a source of good cheer. Innocence was the form of the spirit, which passed by stealth to the adult outside. Those two, once and for all, have become a pair of conspirators. The sun shines into the room. They are on a hilltop. What the man felt at the sight of the child was something more than responsibility. It was also the urge to defend it. The primitive feeling of standing on two legs and of having suddenly grown strong. At home in the empty apartment, where everything had been made ready for the newborn babe's arrival, the adult took a bath, more copious than ever before, as though he had just gone through the hardship of his life. And true enough, he had just finished a piece of work in which he thought he had attained to the self-evident, casual, yet reliable law he had been aiming at. The newborn babe, the satisfactory completed work, the fabulous midnight moment of oneness with his wife. For the first time in his life, the man, reclining in the steaming hot water, considered himself and saw a kind of a perfection, small, impressive perhaps, but just right for him. He felt an urge to go out. The streets for once were those of a hospitable metropolis. To walk them alone that night was a feast, but on one condition, that no one should know exactly who I am. That was the last oneness for a long time. When the child came into the house, it seemed to him that he was falling back into a cramped childhood when he had done little else but keep an eye on his younger brother and sisters. In past years, movie houses, open streets, and the full looseness that went with them had passed into his flesh and blood. These alone, he felt, left room for the daydreams that made life look like something adventurous and worth mentioning. But in all these footloose years, the handwriting on the wall said to him time and again, "You must change your way of life." Now, inevitably, his life underwent a radical change. He who had been prepared at the most for a few minor adjustments found himself a prisoner in the house, and all he could think while pushing the crying baby around the apartment for hours was unimaginatively that his life was over for a long time to come. In the preceding years, he had often been at odds with his wife. He respected the enthusiasm and conscientiousness she devoted to her craft. It was more magic than work. An outsider could detect no sign of exertion, and on the whole, he considered himself responsible for her. Yet often, in his secret heart, he was convinced that they were not right for each other, that their life together was a lie, and measured by the dream he had had of himself and the woman utterly trivial. There were times when he cursed the marriage as the mistake of his life, but it was with the coming of the child that this episodic disunity became a definitive breach. Just as they had never been really man and wife, they were never, from the very start, real parents. He took it for granted that you went in to the child when it was restless at night. In her opinion, this was wrong, and that in itself could provoke her to sullen, almost hostile silences. She went by the specialist's books and precepts, all of which, however, grounded in experience, he despised. They infuriated him as presumptuous violations of the secret between him and the child. Hadn't the child, in its first appearance, the little face behind the glass partition, scratched it by its own fingernails, and yet to so peaceful, been so world-shatteringly real that anyone who had even glimpsed it would surely know what was to be done. This was the woman's recurrent complaint. In the hospital, she had been cheated out of the guiding vision. Through the fault of others, he had missed the moment of birth, something he had been forever lost to her. The child, she said, was unreal to her. That was why she was afraid of doing something wrong, why she observed other people's rules. This the man failed to understand. Hadn't the child been put into her arms practically the moment it was born? And besides, he couldn't help seeing that she handled it not only more skillfully than he, but more patiently as well. Didn't she concentrate on what she was doing and follow through? Whereas he, no sooner had he achieved the brief moment of bliss in which it seemed that with the stroke of the hand, thanks to the one crucial pulse-beat that was still needed, he had imparted the soothing, life-giving magic of his own self into a sleepless or sick little being, and then so often as not he ran out of energy, and the best he could do, bored and positively yearning to escape into the open, was to sit out his stint with the baby. To make matters worse, the hostility of the outside world seems inevitable in such conditions. No sooner was the child brought home, for instance, than ground was cleared for a high-rise building directly across the street, and the days and nights resounded with jackhammers, and most of the adult's time was spent in writing letters to the builders, who reacted with expressions of surprise, alleging that this is the first time, etc., etc. Still, it takes an all effort to recall such moments of unpleasantness or even depression. What preserved its reality and importance was, in every case, an image to which the memory, with no attempt to transfigure it, but with the certainty that this is my life, returned in grateful triumph. And even in connection with that period, which, to judge by the dates, was one of apathy more than anything else, these flashes of memory revealed a vital energy which nevertheless endured and gave promise for the future. The woman soon went back to her work, and the man took the child for long walks around the city. Avoiding his accustomed busy boulevard, he went the other way, exploring those old, uniformly dark districts where, more than in any other part of the city he had known, the pavement takes on the coloration of the earth below it and the sky above. Thus, as the Doubt maneuvered the baby carriage from roadway to sidewalk and back, the city became the child's native place. Leaf shadows, rain puddles, and snow-fraught air stand for the seasons, which were never before so distinct. The all-night pharmacy, where, after a race through driving snow, in a spacious, festive light, the needed medicine is procured, becomes a new sort of a landmark. And on the winter evening, the television is switched on in his apartment. There sits the man with the child, who, after crawling all over him, finally falls asleep on top of him, with that warming little burden on his stomach. The TV becomes so for once a pure joy. A late afternoon in a deserted S-Bahn station far out of town even leaves him with a Christmas Eve feeling. Though alone on the platform, the Doubt is not a lonely young man or curiosity-prepared gadabout of old and but a prospector in search of lodgings for those entrusted to his case. The unusually large, glass-bright waiting room, the closed but well-stocked newsstand, the snowy air in the hollow below, where the curving tracks glisten in the beams of oncoming trains, all these are good tidings, which he will take home with him. All his images of life that were first year relate to the child, who, however, is physically present in few of them. Indifferent reminiscence might prompt the question, where actually was a child just then? But when memory is warmth and its content in a dark color feeling also outlasting the times of a day, as in an arcade, it can be assumed that the child is nearby, safe and warm. One such glance passes through the concrete gateway deep down into the still empty grass of a giant stadium, blooming an unreasonable fresh green in the floodlight. White breast clouds over every row of seats, where a famous foreign team will soon come running in for a friendship match, or from the top deck of a city bus through the rain-sprinkled windshield onto the urban colors which duplicated in the course of the ride, and by transforming little by little a chaotic jumble of streets into something like a hospitable city. In retrospect, the period when man and wife were still living alone became the time before the child. His vision of the two of them resembled one of the painter's pictures showing a young man standing with a bald head at the seashore, hands propped on hips, waiting. Behind him, only a bright sky, marked, however, around the best arms and with distinct whirls and rays, which one viewer has likened to the winged spirits had hovered around the central figure in the art of former times. And true enough, when later the man looked at a photograph of himself and the woman, it seemed to him that the unborn child was winging its way through the empty air between them. What determined the course of events in the first year was not harmony, but a conflict exacerbated by the spirit of the times. For most members of their generation, the traditional social form had become dead, and the new forms, though not ordained by any external authority, imposed themselves with the power of a universal law. Their closest friend, whom until then one could picture only resolutely alone in his room, on the street or at the movies, suddenly took to living with a group and to strolling down the boulevard arm in arm with any member of people. Now he, who had often been embarrassingly mute, spoke with uncanny ease in the name of all. He, who for a time had actually thought of himself as the preposterous last of his kind, seemed to justify his opposition to the lone individual. The Doubt then began to look on the child as his work, as a pretext for turning his back on history. a pretext, because he knew that even without a child and without work, never he could never have been willing to or able to play an active part in the manifestation of history. He half-heartedly attended a few meetings at which every sentence uttered was a spirit-deadening crime, and regularly delivered a flaming speech forbidding these people, once and for all, ever to open their mouth again to himself on the way downstairs. Often he even attached himself to a demonstration, but vanished after the first few steps. His main feeling was that in the new social groupings was one of unreality, more painful than before in the old times. In the old ones, it had been possible to imagine the future. The new ones set themselves up as the sole possibility, as a compulsory future. And since transvaluation was taking place mostly in the city, there was no getting away from the innovators. Perhaps because of his indecision, it became an address for these people. He had long recognized them as one more hostile power, and his only reason for not expressly repudiating them was that the enemies that they were combating had always been his own sworn enemies. Be that as it may, he soon drew away from them, but in their daily forays through the city, groups were always dropping in at him. He will never forget the look which his intruders from the hostile system cast on the child. If they so much as noticed it, and though without particular intent, the look was an insult to the creature lying there, to its meaningless sounds and movements, and signified contempt, as palpable as it was infuriating. For the trivial of everyday life, he was in a quandary. Instead of showing these utter strangers the outdoor, he surely went out with them. Their presence in the apartment would impinge on the child's air supply, and spend the evening in their pads, either, like them, sitting with the earphones in front of the soundless television screen, or witnessing in polite silence their mildly conspiratory but in a way official deliberations in which the slightest candid, spontaneous utterance would have been a source of embarrassment. In either case, feeling guilty and depraved, because convinced as he was that he sometimes knew the truth and was in duty bound to transmit it, he was, by his mere presence, giving aid and comfort to those phonies. It was a friendless period. His own wife had turned into an unfriendly stranger. The child became all the more real, thanks in part to the remorse with which he literally fled home to it. Slowly he passes through the darkened room to the bed, meanwhile watching himself from above and behind as in a monumental film. This is his place. Shame on all these spurious communes. Shame on me for denying or making a secret of my one true allegiance. Shame on my lip service to your modern world. And so, little by little, it became a certainty to him that the only history his kind of man could acknowledge was the history he saw in the lines of the sleeping child. And yet, in retrospect, his diagonal passage through the bombing warm room was associated with that concerted roar. Never has anything been hellish and inhuman been heard of a charging squad of a riot place in the street below. All this contributed to the story of the child. What the adult chiefly remembered, apart from the usual anecdotes, was that it could show pleasure and was vulnerable. Chapter 2. The child's arrival seems to have sparked off thought that would soon call for a decision. As usual, the adult was slow to make up his mind. But when in the following winter he finally arrived at the decision, it was, as so often, an irresistible suggestion. The three of them would go away for a time. They would go to a foreign country. At this idea, the adult for once foresaw himself, his wife and child, as a family. A glorious day in March, when the white enamel of an empty kitchen shines with the light of the city of the heart's desire, which unfolds its far-famed rooftops outside the window. The newfangled metal tips on the light switches blink, and the electrical appliances brought from home buzz to no avail because the voltage is too low. This was more than a move, it was an immigration, once and for all, to the right place, for the child as well as for themselves. At the table by the balcony door, night falls and the morning rises like nowhere else in the world, and there they sit, a wee bit frightened but clearly outlined, at their first family meal. They had begun a new life. The city turned out to be totally different from the metropolis that had shown itself on their short visits. Instead of the miles and miles of movie houses, cafes, and boulevards they had looked forward to, it reduced itself to a small circle of pharmacies, self-service stores, and laundromats smaller than any circle in their previous experience. The spacious places they had known gave way to the cramped little squares of the residential quarter, shaded by trees and house fronts, which day after day, when he went out with the child in his arms, resounded with the clanging of heavy iron gates, and in time became to stand for a specific neighborhood consisting of sandy, dusty patches of bare ground studded with dog turds. The more distant goals are the woods in the west and southwest, accessible only by long rides on the metro, and that one square where there are only benches but also a miniature amusement park with booths and merry-go-rounds. The square lies deep in another neighborhood beyond the inner ring of boulevards. The expedition takes all afternoon, including the walk there and back through a tangle of mostly narrow streets, with the sudden shifts from silence to deafening noise, from gloom to the gray radiance, from showers to sunshine. On the way they cross a long bridge over a deep chasm lined with hundreds of railroad tracks leading from a nearby terminal into an enormous airy valley between two steep flanks of houses, with its whirlpools and vapor clouds and a row of express trains, a foretaste of the Atlantic beyond. This walk was repeated almost every day. In time, the child ceased to be a burden and became a part of the carrier's body, and in the course of this afternoon, the mere name, Square de Batignolles, came to stand in the adult's mind for an eternal moment with the child. One spring evening, he glimpsed the child there, up there in his private image, in a sand pile. In the midst of the in the midst of other children about the same pre-walking age, she is playing by herself. Twilight mood, caused in part by the cover of foliage over the children, balmy, clear air, some of the faces and hands strikingly bright. He bends over the figure in the red dress. She recognizes him, and without smiling, emanates light. She doesn't mind being there with the others, but she belongs to him, and has long been waiting for him. Now, even more than at the time of her birth, the adult sees the enlightened, all-knowing countenance beyond the baby face, and the calm, edgeless eyes gave him, now and for all time, a look of friendship. For 2 cents, he would hide his face and weep. Later that spring, in the same square, the child was sitting all by herself, astride the horse on one of the merry-go-rounds. It had just stopped raining, and the square is foaming white around the edge, like a reef. The merry-go-round starts with a jolt, and the child, distanced from the adult in a new way, looks up briefly, but then, carried away by the circular motion, forgets herself and has no eyes for anything else. Later the man, with this in mind, remembered a moment in his childhood when, though in the same room as his mother, he suddenly felt her to be heartbreakingly, outrageously far away from him. How can that woman over there be a different person from me? The sight of a carousel with a circling absent figure completes the picture. For the first time, the adult sees the child as a person in her own right, independent of the parent standing over there, someone who should be encouraged in her freedom. Indeed, the space separating the two seems to glow in triumph. The man and the little a equestrian figure, becoming his eyes an exemplary group, behind which the artificial waterfall on the square trumpets mightily. A wishing becomes possible, concomitantly, and an awareness of the passage of time, painful, but not in the same way as its former inability to think of a separatedness. In the autumn, when the child was able to walk, they often rode out to the edge of the city together. She sat motionless on the metro, her dark eyes flashing momentarily as the train pulled into a station. On a warm day in October, the adult lay reading in the grass of the sparsely wooded bois. In the corner of his eye, the child is a patch of nearby color, which at one point disappears from his field of vision and does not come back. When he looks up, he sees her walking among the trees far away. Uh, he runs after her, but does not call and keeps his distance from her. She walks straight ahead, even when there is no path. Walkers with dogs pass between them. One of the dogs jostles the child and knocks her down. Without so much as a look at the dog, she stands right up again and continues in the same direction. Beside a rivulet, its barely flowing water is black with brown leaves. Two turkeys are copulating. When it's over, the male staggers and falls to the ground. The child keeps going, neither faster nor slower. She doesn't look around, doesn't even turn her head, and doesn't seem to get tired, as she ordinarily does after a very few steps. Still at the same distance, the two of them across a patch of meadow, where a breeze can be felt from the nearby river. Much later, the child told the adult that meadows made her think of paradise. There's a lot of rotten wood under the fallen leaves. The child keeps stumbling, but does not change direction. The park is full of people. Mm, the park is full of people, but they all seem to be going the other way. From the stands of the nearby racetrack, shouts of encouragement as the horses turn into the home stretch. It seems to the adult that they have both become giants, with heads and shoulders at treetop level, yet invisible to passerby. They are the fabulous beings whom he has always regarded as the real powers in the thick of alternate realities, yet above them. Arrived at the river, the child stops and folds her hands behind her back. Not far away, on the grassy embankment, another adult is sitting with another child. They are doubles or stand-ins, so to speak. Both are eating ice cream. The river flows past the gleaming globes of the ice cream and the shimmering lines of their throats. Half underwater, a row of wooden cabins left over from a former bathing establishment. Across the river, to the west, a densely built-up chain of hills. Halfway up the slope, orange, white, and violet suburban trains dart past incessantly. The sunset sky is the silver ray. A single leaves and then a whole branch go whirling into empty space. In miraculous accord, the wind blows the bushes on the shore below, and hair in the foreground. The eyewitness implores a blessing on this image, yet keeps cool. He knows that every mystical moment carries within it a universal law which it is incumbent on him to formulate, and which will be valid only when given its appropriate form. He also knows that to think out the sequence of forms implicit in such a moment is the most difficult of human tasks. Then he called out to the child, who turned around to him without surprise, as to her self-evident bodyguard. Uh, Throughout this period, relations between him and his wife were functional at best, and often they thought of each other as that man and that woman. Formerly, when he took a distant view of her professional activity, or while they were together traveling or eating at a fashionable restaurant, he had sensed the luster of untouchability which alone can make a woman the guiding light of a man longs for, which alone had enabled him to regard her as his wife, and for which he consequently honored her with a grateful enthusiasm, as only a chosen one can. Now that the baby was there, they met almost exclusively in the cramped quarter of the household. Here he came to look upon her with indifference and in time with distaste, just as no doubt she who saw little more than before of her hero at his unique work ceased to regard him as someone special, even at a distance, and formed never a note of recognition, let alone of expectancy, although the other has ceased to be anything more than the person who keeps calling up thoughtlessly. The man devalued the friendly, intimate, sacred little gestures and exclamations which had become habitual in his dealings with his wife by transferring them to the child. It was almost as if in the child he had for the first time found what was right for him, as though a wife had become superfluous to him altogether. He even had the impression that he had forced the child on his wife, and that this was his good fortune. Even so, he could not conceive of being alone with the helpless little creature. In his wife's absence, he only stepped into the breach, so to speak, an incompetent nanny. He counted the days until she returned to her duties, but he worried about her as he had always done. He took his role of protector seriously. Without him, he felt, she would go to the dogs. As for his work in the first year, he postponed the great project he had in mind, though without losing sight of it for a single day. For the present he was content with the little things that were not beyond his reach. They too bore his mark. Chapter 3. The idea made its way that the child should grow up outside the city's bustle, and not in an apartment, but in a house, in the open air. Early the following year, this culminated in a return to base. They were not unhappy about it, because it was also a return to a country where their own language was spoken. Later in the spring, a plot of land was found. It was situated in a belt of woodland, with a view of broad Floria plain, which day and night, on the ground and in the air, shimmers of the light of the metropolis nearby. The woman handled most of the business. The man didn't see the place until late summer, when the framework of the house was already complete. He contemplated it with the feeling of uncertainty. A flush of pleasure at his future independence was tempered by the thought that a house, especially a brand new one, and a hitherto unspoiled bit of nature was no longer the right thing. The house would not be ready for some time, and in the meantime, they stayed with friends, a couple with a large apartment in town. For the first time, they lived at close quarters with others, and in the community, resulting from the daily pursuit of common, previously recognized interests. The irritable, defiantly solitary man felt that he had at last discovered a natural mode of life, accustomed to having no one to sympathize with the needs of his work, fully expecting to withdraw into his inner realm at his first sign of such disregard. He encountered for once not only respect for the results of his effort, but constant consideration for the effort itself. The group, whose members he could now rely on interchangeably, also helped him, not only to subordinate the state of the world to his work as he had done before, but in addition to clarify his demands on the world. And thanks primarily to the always present child, these demands become images, without which, of course, nothing could be clarified. No longer belonging to anyone in particular, she moved on with those beautiful autumn days from one to another, with a saving naturalness. She was the regularity principle that seemed to foster unity among the various rooms. This calm severity of her features most likely is situated in the mind of the viewer, who takes her as a model. In the evening, along a long oval table on the square outside the window, the screeching of the streetcars and the luminous sign of a bar named after the bend in the tracks. But the builders took longer than expected, and the necessary extension of the apartment's sharing arrangement brought about a change for the worse. The friends began landlords and the nomads became unwelcome guests, and all looked forward to the day when they would move out. These friends were a couple who had deliberately remained childless. Each had adopted the other instead of a child. The consequence was that once the visiting period had lapsed, the real child threatened the field of taste, smell, and touch that had grown up between them over the years and taken on vital importance. They were no longer inseparable as they had been. They became unsure of each other. More than a troublemaker, the child was a threat to their way of life. The adult had long seen this child at the receiving end of bored, exacerbated, inconvenienced, out-of-sorts looks, which he himself may have caused, but never had he seen such merciless eyes in frozen faces, such unforgiving frowns as in that childless couple. These were looks of impotent rage, brought on by the consciousness that despite their perfect goodwill, they were without rights as opposed to the little creature's outrageously overwhelming right. Of course, they revealed nothing of the kind to the child. At most, they spoke more and more softly and coldly to her, but they showed it in the increasing criticism of the parents' pedagogical method, and their reproaches or silent disapproval struck the man not only as stupidly banal, but also as cold-hearted, perverse, and presumptuous. He was later to come into contact with far worse prophets of childlessness, singly and in pairs. For the most part, they were sharp-sighted, and thanks to their own terrifying freedom from guilt, they were able to say in technical language what was wrong with the child-parent relationship. Some of them actually made a profession of their insight, in love with their own childhood, and its continuous. They proved on closer acquaintance to the grown-up monster. After every encounter with them, it took the man a long time to purge his mind and soul of their analytical certainties, which cut into him like cankers. He cursed these mean, self-righteous prophets as the scum of modern times, and swore to hate them and combat them forever. The ancient dramatists supplied him with the appropriate curse for them. Children are the soul of the old man. He who has not known this suffers less, but his well-being is of the wrong kind. And so, despite the distaste inspired by the nondescript new house and the almost identical new houses around it, the little family felt it was returning to peace and order when at last, in the late fall, it moved into a home of its own. Yet on the whole, the time spent with friends exemplified a life in an aerial, more wholesome, less spirit-killing environment than that of a small family. It made possible the daring flights of a solitude which alone gave the mind the daily world-exploring freedom it needs and spared it in the ensuing collapse into the foresickness and unreality, in which there are neither tangible objects nor discourse. In such surroundings, moreover, one worries less about the child. No longer is it oppressively close one and all. Here it lives at the right distance, one among others, and the child itself is freed from its confinement and to its parents. Those all-powerful duty figures who seem to block its freedom of movement in the larger grouping all become smaller, and whoever they may be, however awkward and self-absorbed, they become, for the moment, partners in a game. On the whole, the prevailing mood in those months were one of perfect naturalness and a balance between concentrated work in the daytime and relaxation in the evening, between introversion with its free-form creating thought and formless extroversion. In short, a succession of days and evenings such as the adult would never again be able to give the child, except perhaps during short visits to the seashore. A dark day in November, if nothing else. A first little living room light is burning in the barely heated new house. Even in retrospect, a moving-in feeling never materialized. For one thing, because the house long remained unfinished, but chiefly because this house had not involved the great decision it might have in times gone by. It was a mere acquisition, comparable to a useful gadget picked up at a bargain sale. Besides, the man had next to nothing to do with building it, whereas he had once upon a time worked so hard on a house for his parents that those days still lived on for him in countless images. Some days later, he attended the neighborhood gathering at which local residents spoke to new residents of a plan to run an express highway through their community, of the chronic water shortage and the lack of accessible schools, and sent them home with a few words of consolation. Busy as it may be, the man trudges forward through the winter night, full of mysterious confidence in the world, for never before had he gone home to my house or our community. The same snow-fraught air in the hollow below in the S-Bahn as 2 years before on his return from a house-hunting expedition, followed by actual snowflakes, these delicate taps in the darkness, swirls at the bends of the community streets. Whooshing up at the edge of the woods, aimlessly he makes a long detour, in the course of which, with the help of the snowy night, the entire locality, the flat-roofed cubes with the woods in the background, takes form for the first time, and all the streets with their new houses and empty lots lead to something free, mysterious, old as the hills. Later that winter, a few months after they had moved in, the woman went away to resume her work. She had made a break of this kind years before. Was she in earnest this time? Still, she had objective reasons for leaving, and there was no formal break. After a first prolonged absence, she returned periodically to be with the child, and not as a visitor. But the fact remained that, to all intents and purposes, the man was left alone with his daughter. Again he was of two minds. He thought his wife had done right, yet he condemned her. How could anyone leave a child even on an impulse that was part of her being? Wasn't a child a natural, obvious, reasonable obligation, beyond all questioning? Wasn't any goal achieved by turning one's back on this manifest, wholly binding reality dishonorable and worthless by definition? And yet he knew that he, with his particular kind of work, was privileged. He had no need to go out as most people did, a circumstance which in a way justified his partner's divergent behavior. Luckily, he had a piece of unfinished work that could be carried on from day to day during his first period along with the child. Early in the afternoon, after his wife's departure, during the child's nap time, the adult crept almost stealthily to his unfinished project. He experienced the first transitional passage as a triumph against the rigors of fate. But soon after the completion of his work, which has time and again brought something of the outside world, of the open air, into the walled-in room, the house with the child came to stand for a worse seclusion and immobility than ever before. It was this that first made him feel forsaken. And the embodiment of his forsakenness was the child playing by herself, alone in the room with the adult, who does nothing but stand there stiffly. Misery and forlornness, a sense of tragedy, spring at him from the crown of her head, the curve of her shoulders, her bare feet, though as a matter of fact the child was hardly conscious of any difference. She was already used to having only one parent look after her, and after a while she made it clear, once and for all, as long as one of you is here. In those weeks of bewilderment, no future was thinkable, but he had no desire to go back. He realized that what had happened was irrevocable. His days along with the child passed differently. They were no longer a mere interval. True, he still counted them, but now with a new kind of reckoning in which he had no right to appeal to an outsider for help. Beyond a doubt, he alone was needed, and no one else. It was impossible to go on just doing this bit undisturbed in his self-immersion as he had done before the war. Yes, the source of this inner happening, his free flow of his daydreams, was broken for good. By the crisis which previously, during the period of a listless peace, he had often thought would be the beginning of a alert, wide-awake kind of life, the right kind. And pathetically significant as the crisis turned out to be, the idea held good. The adult did not resign himself to his situation. He accepted it willingly, or so he thought. Of this, his new time reckoning, no longer implying an end, was a proud indication, and many a time his new way of counting helped him to go on, count and live. That was the idea, and in each of the separate phases, it was predictable. Nothing humanly impossible was asked of him, just that he had to give up certain habits. But in daily practice, he often failed. Here, for the first time, it became apparent that he, who had scarcely an equal for thinking himself above ingrained habits, was as much a slave to them as anyone else. His whole existence, like anyone else's, was made up of habits. They alone gave his life a semblance of a regularity. Cut off from his personal routines, his daily life, regulated by a child's rhythm and consisting almost exclusively of child's sounds and child's belongings, struck him more and more as a brutal and senseless doom. Things were out of kilter, as evil and unreal as weapons, and the interstices were as airless as the compartments of an arsenal. This was the world in which he had been banished, and in his mind all was hostile confusion. It was a long while before he had learned not only to tolerate the child's playthings, but in addition, however heedlessly and even contemptuously, everything seems to be scattered, to find order in disorder, and to feel at home in it as the child did. At first, however, he was seized with a frenzy for making order, though all he actually did was to thrash about in a vacuum. At such times, he felt a malignant stupidity coming over him, and because he hardly saw anyone else, he stupidly blamed the child for it. Confined as he was to the house and seldom enjoying a moment's peace, he gradually lost his feelings for colors and forms, as well as the spacing and arrangement of objects, and saw himself in the sinister, vision blurring half light, surrounded by them as by tarnished mirrors. And in the midst of all that, the child moved about like one indistinct object among others. This was unreality, and unreality means you are alone. There is no one else. The next step was an absence of thought, scarcely distinguishable from madness. He had lost all power over himself, and fear deprived him of his will. Then came the day of guilt, the children's hour. The spring was far advanced. After a rainy night, the ground floor of the brand-new house was flooded. It had happened a few times before, but that morning the water was higher than ever. This time an honest to goodness flood. Still half asleep, he stared with murder in his heart at the brownish water. From upstairs he heard the child's repeated cries, something that stymied her, ending on a note of desperation. The adult, standing knee-deep in water, lost his head, rushing upstairs like a killer. He struck the child in the face with all his might, as he had never in all his life struck anyone. His horror was instantaneous. He carried the crying child, he himself suffering bitterly from his lack of tears, from room to room. Everywhere the gates of judgment stood open. Bursts of heat struck him like blasts from muted trumpets. Though the child showed no ill effects other than a swollen cheek, he knew that he had hit her hard enough to kill her. At first he regarded himself as evil. He was not only a scoundrel, he was depraved, and no earthly punishment could atone for what he had done. One endearing real thing he had given him his only happiness, and now he had destroyed it. He had destroyed the one thing he wanted to perpetuate and glorify. Eternally damned, he sat down with the child and spoke to her, more from the need to speak than really imbued with what he was saying. In the haste to unutterable, unthinkable, odious forms of human speech. But the child nodded at his words, and then, as once before, then there appeared in the quietly weeping face of a clear, radiant air a pair of eyes, raised as it were above the mist of the environing world. Seldom has an unhappy mortal known as a brighter consolation. So she understands the adult and takes pity on him. With this kindness, the child, for the first time in her history, appears in the active role, and her action, like all her future actions on different occasions, is as casual as a meeting between forehead and forehead, and at the same time as perfectly laconic as the carry-on signal of an experienced referee. Of course, this mute visual consolation was not enough. The adult state of abjectness lasted until the incident and had been explicitly, and not just once, but time and time again, confessed to a third party. That day stands out in the adult's memory as one of those exceptional days concerning which it can be said that the grass was green, the sun was shining, the rain falling, the clouds drifting. The dusk fell and the night was silent, all these being marks of a different sort, assuredly the right sort, of human life, at times surmised to be eternal. Then the wooded hill at the foot of which the community is situated emerges in the distance. From all sides the trees rise skyward in an even sweep, and a gentle regular incline, which seems to lean onward to infinity, gives the hill a feeling of fertility. The bright rocky spots between the trees glitter, and in the distance, like a crystal of sea foam, and lie on the chest like liberating compasses. For a moment, the foreign river minders through the foreground, its radiance reaching out beyond all possible frontiers, and in sorrow over an omission or a commission does my life expand to epic proportions. Chapter 4. The child was now more than 3 years old. Thus far, she had played along almost exclusively, turned inward in quiet contentment, unlike the gloomily self-absorbed adult. But in the course of time, both had made themselves at home in the community on the wooded slope, and the adult was sick of visitors who, with their falsely sympathetic or ironically satisfied remarks about the house and its location, regularly demolished what little spirit that place had. One, who expressed himself only in enforced quips, with which indeed he made his living, spoke of the clip-clop community, the reference being to the clatter of high-heeled shoes in the silence of the night. But more and more often, children from the neighboring houses who come to visit, and through them a kind of a neighborhood feeling arose. Being with others was something new to the child. It seemed to change her sensitiveness, in which the adult had so delighted, into a spoiled sport prisoness. The trifling setback would throw her into such a rage that the other children would stand there gaping, and this in turn would transform her dismay into utter misery, so adding to the glee of the stranger around her, who would be as likely as not to ring the doorbell again the next day, possibly in the expectation of another such scene. At the same time, a reversal occurred. No longer was the adult alone with the child. Although her encounters with children of her age had almost always ended with a sense of injury and defeat, she soon began to look forward to these visits, not so much with pleasure as with excitement. For a while, at least, she lost her ability to immerse herself with splendid equanimity in every trifle. The adult was no longer what she wanted, and often, when at last the voice of a neighbor child approached the house, the sound was welcome to the two of them. Again he was of two minds. Would it be the best to remain alone, the child playing, the adult working, and to the best of his ability present, both prepared to speak and listen? Yet child and adult had they had always been, without precocity on the one side or condensation on the other, or were children not race apart, in their element only among themselves and their alone, regardless of all the injury and injustice, capable of moving with self-awareness and making something of themselves. So weren't other children their true family, and weren't adults entitled at the most to take care of them? Wasn't it plain in any case that even after the most unpleasant incident, the worst humiliation, the child would welcome another child as a bringer of good tidings? The dilemma was resolved when the man at last hit on an idea implying a proposal to others. The material foundation of the idea on the strength of which a proposal to others became possible was that, as it had always been, as a specific place, a location. Our first conversation with neighbors had been confined almost exclusively to the new community and the children. The complaints about the distance from all public conveniences and the desire not for a kindergarten or its modern equivalent, but rather for a modest little meeting place, accessible without a car and open at definite hours, undoubtedly a necessity for those children who could not yet make a playground of the surrounding country and were consequently confined into their own house or the other next door. This desire became practicable when a locale was thought of. A large, hitherto unused room in the man's house, with a southern exposure and a free access to a large front yard. The availability of the locale even made enthusiasm possible. That this at last was the right thing to do. Dispelled were the suspicions usual among people who are strangers to one another. By early summer, the room was suitably remodeled, and the following autumn, a kind of a club was opened informally with a few children. In the ensuing period, adults spent a few half-days as a kind of a counselor, saw his own child with an unaccustomed number of others, and began, no other word would be appropriate, to doubt her, not as an individual, but as a superior authority. His dominant feeling for her, even outweighing affection, had always been an unconditional, enthusiastic confidence, without ever forming an idea of children in general. He believed in this particular child. He was convinced that she embodied an important law which he himself had either forgotten or never known. In the very first moment of her life, he had seen her as a personal teacher. What he had faith in was not any particular utterance from the mouth of the babe, but her mere existence as a human being who was what she was. The fact of her existence was to the doubt the measure of truth of her life as it should be. In this light, he was able to respect her dispassionately, and at times allow himself to utter certain words which he had hitherto rejected as pathos. Shut his tears to at the movies, close his eyes to as obsolete in old books, and which now turned out to be more real than anything else in the world. Who were these fools who had dared to claim that these high-sounding words were of a purely historical interest at that time, had divested them of their meaning? Weren't they, in their blindness, or perhaps only lukewarmness and faint-heartedness, confusing words with whole sentences? How did these modern people live, and with whom, and what had they forgotten once and for all? And that they should listen only to pusillanimous yet loudmouthed, and to the whole anything but open-minded language. Why do all the terms current in public speeches, in the daily papers and on television, but also in new books and personal relations, have the crushing, stinkingly banal, soul-murdering, godless, nerve-shattering, bare-brained quality of dogs' names? Why on all sides did one hear only the drum's laughter of a sheet metal age? In any case, it was thanks to the child that the much despised great words became more intelligible to the adult with each passing day. These words didn't make for hubris, but carry you to higher and higher levels. And anyone was welcome to them. The only prerequisites being goodwill and insight into strict necessity. A doubt came when he saw the child not alone with the random individual, but in her regular group, there in the midst of the majority. She ceased to be a heaven of peace and was gradually, from day to day, metamorphosized into an earthworm, written with fear, more wretched than all the rest. No longer was she prissy, no longer ill-tempered or even listless. She was simply beside herself with misery. In the group, the child who by herself had been so wonderfully slow-moving, humorous, and intelligent was at best excitable and obtuse. Most of the time, she displayed blind panic, accompanied by an acute, groundless, immediately perceptible anguish. No sooner in the crowd, she struggles, like one forcibly held under water, to escape, looks in her misery for a scheduled room, but is usually unable to find so much as a quiet corner. Thus far, her story has presented an even flow. Not only now is its irrevocable, diabolical inevitability revealed, and the doubt's doubt, like this previous faith, pertains not so much to her special characteristics as to her whole existence. If she, as she is forced to become something different, she obviously ceases to be anything at all. But was she made for this apparently necessary tragedy of destruction? Here the doubt is preoccupied with the emotional, pointless questions that have probably been talked to death, yet they are made understandable by the despairing glances of the midst of the mob, which go straight to his heart and express something more urgent than mere doubt. Of course, the parents connected with the group knew the reason for the child's behavior, but all he heard in their explanation was more dogs' names. Seeing no cause, he was nevertheless convinced that he knew better. Besides, it was plain that some of the children, even the smallest, was not right for one another. There may have been no wicked ones, but certainly all were not innocent, or knew what was wrong and did wrong, not only in passion but also with premeditation. Yet even then, without consciousness of wrongdoing, with the result that their actions were often more sinister than those of the most sordid scoundrels, and just as revolting. It couldn't be denied that among the children, regardless of sex, there were some who from the start were quite at their ease of playing the executioner in word and deed. With the doubts looking on, they performed their act of destruction with cool expertness, and when it was done, walked calmly away as from an official function. And it was equally unquestionable that none of the children liked being scolded, made fun of, or beaten, in other words, victimized. It was then the prevailing opinion that adults should not interfere in children's squabbles. Nevertheless, it was hard on the adult, seeing that his child getting the short end of it day after day. For she alone never defended herself, even when punched in the face. Her only response was to flail about in the void, and the sounds that came out of her mouth were not battle cries but helpless whimperings. When insulted or accused, she never replied in kind and never ran away, but stood spellbound on the spot, physically bent beneath the hostile harangue, which in the end boiled down to a repetition of one especially wounding word or phrase. In her rebuttal, she did no more than tonelessly deny everything, thus by her voice and posture identifying herself as the accused. Impossible, at the sight of this pale, trembling thing, to refrain from stepping in, and so, as often as not, the adult stepped in, took sides, and found fault with his sniveling solipsistic asocial child. But by little, as time went on, the children merged into a free, easygoing, and even amiable little band, or perhaps the adult had only learned to look at them with new eyes. One spring day, he climbed a hill with them, and observing himself was so perfect joy, simply because he was moving among so many different children. His enthusiasm gave him, for the first time, a voice to which they listened. It was as though he had leaped into their midst. Here he no longer saw ruffians and victims as he had when looking at them from outside. No doubt about it. It was only when he had begun to take pleasure in their company that his forlorn standing around and frantic running around gave way to a natural buoyancy and ultimately to a proud poise and no longer a childlike participation in their common adventure. A lasting image must as a rule be grounded, as it were, in the feel of a certain terrain, its upward or downward slope, roughness or smoothness. In this case, we have a steep slope, which all the children are climbing vigorously, though they are strung out over quite a distance, and they are constantly changing places. Each one knows as a rule where the others are, and none will get lost. Never before has a adult been conscious of a gentler, happier power over others. His newly won lightheartedness rubbed off on his own child. Once more, she was able to be what she was. Among others, her movements were distinctly more spontaneous and self-assured than in her solitary days. The adult realized that all he had to do was leave her be, but that the ideal ordering energy, the drive that held them all together, would operate only if he remains for her, the ever-present one, with whom they could journey safely as in the hold of a ship of peace. True, he was not always equal to this twofold power. That would have been high art. But little by little, he assimilated the idea of a good teacher. Just then, however, just as he was taking comfort, he was forced to recognize that the child really was different from most of those in the group. She had ceased to be a loner, but she still got in the way, though not very noticeably, and when playing games showed her the excess of zeal and a slight baldement that are sometimes found in the bee's children. But what particularly sets her apart from the other children is her manner of speaking, or perhaps it is only that she spoke more deliberately, choosing her words with greater care. In any case, this habit of speech made her lag behind or made what she was saying go unheard. True, the glance she cast at the adult from out of the turmoil is no longer a forlorn, imploring stare. It twinkles with good-natured irony. She is content to be with those people, but they are not her people. And here it passes through the adult's mind. The people exist. They are somewhere else, a different people with a different history. We're not the only ones at this very moment. We're moving through time with these other people. You will never be alone. And at the same time, the adult once again caught sight of the drama to come and actually looked forward to it. For though he saw many parents who armed their children for the struggle, and though he understood this perfectly, he felt that the right way was to do nothing of the kind. Chapter 5. There was something outrageous about moving back to the beloved foreign city with the child, who by then was about 5 and had grown accustomed to the community on the edge of the woods. But he didn't hesitate long, for he thought of it as a natural and even necessary thing to do, requiring no justification. He felt that the image spoke for itself, a man taking his own and setting out for an unfamiliar world. Shouldn't everyone attempt at something of the kind time and time again? Wasn't it in foreign surroundings that a man's own becomes his determining certainty? Besides, In going back to the foreign city, he was simply resuming the regular life he had led there. Throughout the interim, he had thought of the distant metropolis as its permanent base. It was the only place that gave him a feeling of reality for any length of time, a lasting time between outside and inside, body and soul. And with regard to his charge, he had always thought, what's good for me is good for her. In the foreign country, the child's history without unusual events became a small paradigm of the history of the nations and of ethnology as well. And the child herself, by none of her own doing, became the heroine of frightening, sublime, ridiculous, and on the whole plausible everyday eternal happenings. On a day in December, they arrived in the somber apartment, brightened by the sparkling water that flows with the brook-like gurgling in the gutter outside, and by the vault to be found nowhere else in the world, of the sky over the fringe of the metropolis, where the staggered traffic lights reached out into the void, incessantly jumping about, changing colors, and pointing the way to a vast and sweetly mysterious western gate. Here the large grass plots around the house in the community, which brought nature constantly close, are replaced by narrow French windows with small diamond-shaped panes in which the outside world seems reduced to the right scale, and the silence of the house is replaced by the sound of steps from the floor above and the voices next door. When at first was welcome something long missed, the main alien objects in the apartment borrow an air of familiarity from the few things that have been brought along. Books and stuffed animals suffice, and the long hallway leading to the surprisingly long back rooms has the feel of a suite in a luxurious hotel. The child and her had her first school day toward the end of winter in midterm. This had not been planned by the adult, it just happened. The school also happened to be a special sort of school, intended, that is, only for children of the one people deserving of the name, the people which, long before its dispersion to the four corners of the earth, it was said that, even without prophets, without sacrifices, without idols, and even without names, it would still be a people, and whom, in the words of the latter biblical scholar, was wishing to know the tradition, the oldest and the strictest law in the world, will be obliged to consult. It was only an actual people to which the adult had ever wished to belong. The schoolhouse resembled many city schoolhouses, with their small, dusty yard, cramped, ill-lit rooms, and the rumbling of the metro from deep underground. But taking the child there gave the adult a feeling that he was going the right way. A vast and, for once, absolutely supra-personal feeling of happiness. His child, by birth and language, a descendant of murderers who seemed condemned to flounder for all time, without aim or joy, metaphysically dead, would learn the binding tradition, would go her way with others of her kind, and embody the steadfast, living earnestness which he who had been rendered incapable of tradition knew to be necessary, but forfeited day after day to frivolous caprice. Though the child was accepted only provisionally for one semester, he hoped she would stay there for good, and not only in the school, just as she was, despite the color of her hair and eyes, wasn't that where she belonged? And these strange holiday celebrations in which the child, a participant and not just an onlooker, joined the others in the symbolic gesture recapitulating their exemplary history, didn't such celebration at last supply a possible meaning for words such as community or initiation? And when for the first time the adult saw the child transcribing the strange characters of the ancient language, did he not experience a kind of one witnessing a historical moment? The child, too, was pleased with the school. She didn't even have to get used to it. With the first step across the threshold into the little vestibule with its layers of different colored coats hanging on hooks, she had forgotten her fear, as one sometimes forgets a burden, thanks no doubt to the teacher by whom, through the usual hubbub, she immediately and for all time felt seen. This old woman had mastered the art of the inquiring yet overwhelmingly hospitable glance. And it was she, herself of German descent, she spoke German, who taught the child the language of the land in no time. It was not yet summer when the adult heard the child engage in a fluent conversation with the other children. How charming she seemed when speaking the foreign language. Whenever she slipped into it, she seemed to summon it up by magic, but never employed the unfortunate turns of phrase used by many of the native children. Listening to her, the adult remembered how he himself, as a child, had longed to speak a foreign language and had occasionally mistaken a certain play gibberish for one. He saw that his child was now in many respects ahead of him, and for that he was thankful to be living in the present time. It seemed to the adult that the child's life and his own were on the right track, and so he argued with the fervor one imbued with the exemplary fitness of things that they were. When toward the end of the school year, the principal suggested the child should be transferred to a different school. In the autumn, she said, religious instruction would begin, and since the child came of a basically different tradition, no good would come of it. Citing his experience of many years, the adult tried to persuade the woman that no tradition, however longed for, would ever be meaningful to someone like him, and that he could certainly transmit no trace of any tradition to his child. But the elder teacher felt that she knew better and merely shook her head. When he left the schoolhouse with the child on that last day, it seemed to him that he had been banished without guilt, and that he, the scion of an unworthy man of no people, bore the responsibility. The same year witnessed a conflict between man and child that was something more than momentary irritation. In the past year, he had adjusted his work schedule entirely to the child's needs. During the day, he could be a little more than her provider, and in time he came to think of this as a splendid role and worthy occupation, even when it proved impossible to switch to another activity in the evenings, and he often sat silent for hours, not knowing how to go on, occasionally seized with a desperate longing for such accessories of leisure as wine and books or television set, until suddenly, amid the sea of silence, an idea might come to him and transform the table he was sitting at into a writing desk. But what emerged was transitional bits and pieces, and little by little he conceived a desire for the larger project he had long carried in the back of his mind. One often appeared to him as a dream of paradise, a realization of which must, as hitherto, determine his continued existence. The time seemed to have come thanks to school, which in that country took up almost the entire day. But the 8 hours of freedom were not enough. It turned out that his work trip, if it were to carry exemplary force and proceed in the right sequence, would have to go on day and night. And though the child would never particularly disturb him, she interrupted his work dream, or rather prevented from getting started. The present arrangement might leave room for a coherent act of minor insights, but he was not often able to convert experience into invention as one must if a piece of work is to be glorious and a joy to others. And this absence of form, he thought, was the fault of the child, who by her mere existence paralyzed his imagination and diverted them from his destiny. There was no violence between them, only unfriendliness on the adult's part against his own better judgment, verging on hostility. He was unable to give himself wholly either to his work or to the child, and the child, sensing the change in him, withdrew of her own accord, not in an offended sulk, but proudly. On one occasion, she said of her father, "I don't want to see him any more. Let him go away." This laconic threat of rupture terrified the adult and brought him to his senses. He postponed his long journey and became suspicious of all those who, tied down as he was, had ever forsaken the day-to-day, wrought in the name of a lifelong dream. Their deeds lost their radiance. He no longer believed in them. So once again, he confined himself to his short-term projects, and in the end, he was content with that. Often he did no work at all, wandered about in the town in all directions, from its highest point to its lowest, and relished the freedom of his idleness gave him. At this point, his spells of activity coincided with the child's absences, but then there was something uneasy and secretive about the fanaticism with which he then stuck to his project day after day, although what was a vision to the adolescent had become almost a vice to the adult. Even in his moments of magical light, the emptiness of the house, where he no longer had anyone to return to, was overpowering, seeping into him like a poison gas until he became rigid and empty. And then he knew it was a child who gave the passing hours their consecration. Without the child, he was God-forsaken, and his activity seemed excessive and meaningless. Coming home one night, he stood leaning on something in the thrilled silence of the apartment, and it occurred to him that some people must drop dead from sheer loneliness. It was at that time that visitor began to tell the man that his way of living and working was taking him further and further from reality and the present. He had once taken such criticism seriously, but after all these years with the child, he felt that no one had the right to lecture him about reality. For gradually, through the insoluble conflict between his work and the child, he had come to the conclusion that with the child, free at last from the fraudulent life of modern times, he was continuing a kind of a trans-temporal Middle Ages, which had perhaps never existed, but which to him, when beside the child's sick bed, when bidding her goodbye or just hearing her bouncy steps, struck him as the only true, authentic epoch behind and beyond the so-called modern era. The reality mongers, he felt, were the tyrants of a new day. With their mania for measuring degrees of reality, they reminded him of those sea captains in the oldest accounts of naval battles who, once the fighting had stopped, would total up the corpses and the wreckage washed ashore and diagnose victory or defeat accordingly. The two belong to human eternity, but to the bad kind. If you listened a while to these born public prosecutors, it soon turned out that, as a rule, with their counting of worlds, the third and fourth were the most relevant. They were trying to drown out the sacred guilt, if not an unforgivable betrayal. They had all done much evil. These reality mongers, likelihood the world had always warmed with them, struck the doubt as empty existences, remote from creation, though long dead. They kept going with a vigor equaled only by their weakness, left nothing behind them that anyone could hold on to, and were good for nothing but war. It was useless to argue with them, because they were convinced that each new daily catastrophe confirmed their beliefs. If you had an idea, you couldn't talk to them or even approach them. They were strangers, and I don't want to talk to strangers. Away with you. I am the voice, not you. And so he decided to close his door irrevocably to those depressing intruders, and in general not to let their ships bar the seas to him any longer. Only then did he hear the murmur of a reality again. Oh, murmur, stay with us. In the summer of the same year, the child returned with her parents to the country they came from, where she was to spend her vacation with her mother. For her return to her father in the autumn, a new school had been found, not far from the old one. The motor trip took them from the metropolitan basin, broadly above sea level, through a vast terraced landscape rising in an even rhythm to the low mountain range, from the crest of which one can look down across the frontier river to the next large country. Those hilltops were much disputed in a world war, and their almost total barrenness provides a more enduring reminder than the many commemorative monuments of the battles fought there. On the afternoon of the trip, the three of them are sitting on one of these hillside slopes, looking westward. From here, the structure of the terraced country, extending as far as the metropolitan basin, almost a day's journey distant, can be seen clearly. A quarrel starts out between man and woman. It is pretty much like some of their earlier quarrels, and probably the man can't even help thinking, makes use of the exact same terms that they are passing back and forth between disunited knights all over the world at this same moment. But it's serious all the time, all the same. And despite his better judgment, despite the peace that pervades the country all about, he lets himself be engulfed in a mechanical exchange of insults. When at last he looks up, he sees the child has sat down at some distance from both parents. Her face looks pale and severe in the distance. Far across the slope, blueberries sparkle in the sun. At the foot of the hill, a marshy pond. The light of this day is glistening bright, interspersed with great cloud shadows, and the three figures sit there like white tombstones. Years later, in another summer, the man would approach the same mountain range, this time from the eastern plain over a road that often led through vineyards, not in a car but on foot, and toward evening, when darkness had settled on the ridge, the slowly moving wayfarer suddenly saw himself sitting with the two absent ones in the distant, inky blackness, just as in old legend kings sit enthroned on the mountains. But he saw them not as kings, nor yet as a family, but as an abstract triad, cloaked in impenetrable substance. This was the only mystical moment in which the man had ever seen himself in the plural, and only such moment engender myth, eternal story. The illumination vanished, but a certain exaltation remains. Still, the wayfarer makes his way across a high plateau toward the blue-veiled mountain chain, still busy with the thought that can never be carried to a conclusion. I am working on this secret of the world, and this spot, like the square long ago, has a name of its own that is lostly associated with the child. Le Grand Ballon. Chapter 6. But it was again through the child that in the following winter, a few months after their return to the city and the change of schools, the adult was brutally made aware of the hasty, impatient, and above all unrealistic nature of the striving for reconciliation that had guided him all his life, though he remained convinced that this was the rational attitude. One day he received a letter with no return address, in rather ornate and recondite terms. This letter, in the name of the one people, threatened the child as a dissident of the people's worst persecutor with death. In the general neighborhood of the people's school, the man had made the acquaintance of a few adults connected with it, whom he continued to see later, and whom he came to know much more intimately than any strangers he had ever met before. Thus it didn't take him long to find out who had written that dissecting, dismembering, etc., inasmuch as the millions of victims have not been raised from the dead. And the end of the threatening letter gave himself an Old Testament name. Detective-like, he ferreted out the man's address, put a knife into his pocket, and started out, feeling ungainly, but at the same time aware of being at the center of a historic event. In the cab, he visualized the exact sequence of quick movements ending with the knife thrust to the heart. He saw himself before the act, standing magnificent in an attitude of sternest judgment. But no sooner has he crossed the letter writer's threshold than the grotesqueness of the situation crowds out all other thoughts. He doesn't kill, not this time. Weakness in the rest. He does actually, in a manner of speaking, drive the other into a back room, where they just stand there with smug grins on their faces, both feeling rather flattered. The one, because his cleverness in locating the letter writer is admired. The other, because he is taken seriously. Together, they leave the cold apartment and repair to the large cemetery nearby, where they trot back and forth, talking of everything under the sun, at the end of which they know they will never be enemies, or allies either, for that matter. It was only on his way home alone in the darkness that this man began to understand what happened. In the quiet street near his apartment, he glimpsed, high up in the night sky, a single attic window with a peaceful reddish-yellow light in it. He stood there. Now at last he is seized with real indignation, or rather bitterness. Now he curses those non-beings who need history for their lives. He curses history itself and personally disavow it. Here, for the first time, he gains a vision of himself alone with a child in the night of the century and in the empty crypt of the continent. And yet all this provides energy for this new kind of a freedom to come. But from that day on, his dominant feeling with regard to the child's history is one of bitterness. This was the feeling closest to reality, along with grief and joy. During the first year at the new school, the child was often unhappy, yet one could not have conceived of a finer building or location. The building was small and full of twists and turns, yet as bright as a ship or a house on the island, and seemed to occupy a domain of its own, at sufficient distance from a large housing development. The garden surrounding it was irregularly shaped, offering plenty of hiding places for the not very numerous pupils. There were patches of tall grass or sand here and there, and the chickens and the other domestic animals in wire cages. Another part of it, fenced about as in an old memorial park, contained exotic shrubs of a miniature stone pool with bright-colored fish in it, and a small statue overgrown with the same sort of foliage as a house front. Strangest of all, the road leading to the school, which branched off a busy thoroughfare heading out of the city, past a few shop fronts and 2 or 3 imposing portals characteristic of the neighborhood, that narrowed abruptly and began to climb just a little, was unsurfaced from that point on, transforming itself in a dirt path, clay yellow, eroded by the rain, and on both sides flanked by low walls like a sunken nail. Here light and sounds are different from what they were a moment ago in the metropolis, and yet there's nothing rural about this Elysian meadow. Nevertheless, the child had at first to be literally pushed and pulled through the garden gate into the schoolyard. If the dog didn't escape down the path immediately after disentangling himself from her grip, she would try to fight her way back through the crush in the narrow doorway. The children who went to this school were not children of the one people, but children of the city, of the neighborhood, of a wide variety of parents. During the first few months, the adult too, though thought the school, compared to that of the year before, rather deadening. One reason for this, though the school had only a kind of a transitional status, its function being to prepare children for the state secondary school, was a blind learning of names without objects, which seemed to have the same effect on the child as ominous, though utterly unintelligible, official regulations. Later in the day, the adult would see her at home, as she reeled off the length of rivers or the height of mountains required for the next day's lesson. And time again, he would say to himself, "Let it never be forgotten, let it be remembered, till the end of time." With that wide open, terror-stricken eyes, the children of the present day recite the so-called knowledge of humankind. Not until late spring did the child feel more at home in the school, with nothing particular in mind, only because he himself felt like it. The adult took her for walks around the neighborhood on warm evenings, and regularly they would turn off into the dirt path. Now the child sees her school deserted in the dusk. Sometimes the grumpy old woman, who is the principal of is the watering plants out in front, raking the sand for the next day, and feeding the animals, The timbering in the walls is visible through the ivy. Far in the distance, the horns of calamitous motor vehicles, rustling in the dark bushes, the sleeping chickens, shimmering on the stone path. Could we stay here a little longer? For on the last days of the school year, it gave the child pleasure to pass through the gate in the morning when no one else was there, stroll around in the garden, and exhibit herself to the next arrivals at the first. In the following year, there were times when the child was reluctant to go home with a doubt in the afternoon and would have preferred to stay outside in the schoolhouse playing with others. There, in what had become for her a particular place, she now found herself in good or at least satisfactory company, forgot her solitary brooding, but preserved her sensibility. In the winter, when she went to the mountains with her class, she hardly suffered at all from homesickness. On her first night away from home, she had been one of the last in the dormitories to start crying, and even then, it had been to keep the others company. It didn't trouble her that the teachers at school were sometimes unreasonably strict. Sometimes, in fact, she welcomed this as a special attention. When faced with injustice, she expressed surprise, and as time went on, the lessons lost their earthbound heaviness and even became a sort of a game, contrasting with the rest of the days. Opening a copybook could have folded out as well when hearing her lessons over a clear, bright vista. At the commencement exercise the following summer, after the second year at the little school, the adult detects a physical change in the child. He has gotten into the habit of regarding her as awkward and helpless, but now she is taking part in a kind of a round dance in the garden. From the very next step, he is a self-assurance personified. In this dance, she isn't just one among others. No, as soon becomes evident, she is leading the round, without the slightest glimmer of the embarrassment the onlooker had feared. It is she who signals faster or slower, or change direction, and the onlooker's after-image, her air of a quiet triumph makes the entire garden group uh, amid the clouds of schoolyard dust to burst into flaming color. No doubt the transfiguration was largely a product of leave-taking, for on the same day the little school ceased to exist and its pupils went off in different directions. The following fall, they dispersed to many different state schools. Chapter 7. They moved to a suburban house on a hill across the river. The new state school was outside the city limits, not far from a main railroad line to the sea. The adult felt that the change would be bearable for the child. Indeed, he was optimistic because the building and its location were similar in many respects to those of the beloved little school. Here too, the ivy-covered facade and the dark timbering of the walls suggested a country inn or manor rather than a school. And likewise, the interior, the layout of the classrooms, the windows looking out on the garden, whose trees with their aerial roots, bushes, and underbrush offered the same sort of a hiding place as the old garden. One of the paths was even on surface like the path leading to the other school, and also sloped gently. Couldn't that be expected to make the child feel at home? But the child froze at the sight of the new school, and time did not dispel her revulsion. Indeed, it increased from day to day. Here, the evening walk formula was ineffectual. Yes, the school ground were a place of peace, but in the morning the placeless misery was back again. At first, school friends came to the house, but unmistakably avoided her the next day in class, and the child, who was not yet 8, knew the reason why. They hate me because I'm German. But that wasn't the worst. The hostility that could be expressed in words wasn't so bad. What hurt her most was being ignored, being shoved aside, looking in vain for a place. The most dreaded part of the day became the recess, When the adult called for her in the late afternoon, she almost always, even if she was in some remote corner, saw him coming. Grown-ups have their ways of hiding despair. In a child, it is always noticeable, and the sight of the child who has given up hope was unbearable. He felt, with something approaching urgency, that his charge must be taken out of school, and once in 3 months, when to his own surprise he said aloud that they could perfectly well manage by themselves without other people, an almost uncanny cry or sigh or agreement came from the child's innermost soul. He reflected. Hadn't he learned something from the image of the child dancing around with other children? No, the child did not belong to him alone. She needed a larger community. She was not only capable of social life, but made for it. That was the right way. The right community existed. There could be no question of turning back. A strange repetition of that dance brought certainty. A teacher from the little school had died, and one November evening the adult took the child from the suburb back to the old city neighborhood to attend the funeral service. Nearly all the former pupils had come to the church with their parents, and even during Mass, the children, most of whom had not seen one another since the commencement exercises, kept turning to exchange looks. In the somber, vaulted church, not only the children's clothes seemed strangely brighter than those of the grown-ups, but their faces as well, and everything about them. Or was that only because the grown-ups was sat so still? Afterwards, when the mourners gather outside the church, children's voices are just about the only sound to be heard. The children scream, laugh aloud, grab hold of one another, run shouting among the soft-spoken mourners who make no attempt to stop the dance, but are perhaps more deeply moved by the wild merriment all about them than they were about the funeral service. It's an unusually bright evening, with the shining yellow full moon overhead and the demonic dancing of the children down below. Parting comes hard, this entangling of intertwined arms and legs which have briefly belonged to a single body. It's late by the time the child is sitting in the suburban bus, almost alone with the adult. She is exhausted yet wide awake, and undoubtedly in seventh heaven. Most of all, she is surprised, suddenly, seeing all those old friends, being greeted by them with such joy, and in dancing, completely forgetting the teacher's death. The light inside the empty night bus was very white. They crossed the bridge. The river is high water and looks unusually wide and dark, with here and there a glimmer of moonlight and the top of a submerged bush. To the adult, the child's face glowing with life and enthusiasm as she sat there, reliving the hour spent with the other children, is a picture of a tragic beauty. The dead teacher had been especially fond of the child, and after the funeral it dawned on the adult that what repelled the child about the new school was not its state character, as he had over hastily concluded on the strength of its own past experience, but her class teacher, who was not right for her. It came to him that there is a kind of a passionless, lifeless friendliness which, coming from a teacher, can have the effect of a hostility and unkindness. In this he may have recognized his own self-absorbed absence and realized what an inhuman effect it could have. After the first term, the child gave up her resistance to the new school, and from then on hardly spoke of daily happenings. She even seemed to accept her lot, but sometimes, when she looked up at him, the adult detected an air of resignation, such as he had hitherto seen only in the eyes of one much older person, a look suggesting the saddest and most extreme constraint. In a peaceful hour, when he was once again able to question her, the child told him she didn't like herself any more. The others weren't so bad, she said, but she's just something wrong with me. There's just something wrong with me. The next day, the man went to see the class teacher, as he had done a few times before. He tried his best to keep calm, but he was unable to avoid such words as loneliness, despair, exclusion, which in the foreign language may have sounded even more stereotyped than in his own. All at once, He noticed that the lady facing him did not, in the fullest sense, understand. A strange expression which the petitioner would never forget crept into the teacher's face. There was amusement in it, and intermittently outright contempt, the look of a person in an airtight world where such a thing as foresickness was inconceivable. In that moment, his mind was made up. Midterm or not, the child would leave the school that very day. But on the other hand, she would not spend a single day at home with the doubt. From this interview, he goes straight to another school, which is also near the railroad tracks, but on the other side. The one thing that he knows about it is that it bears the name of a saint, who was his statue in the paved yard. This school partakes of religious tradition which in his childhood immersed him in a deadly chill belief in ghosts and hatred of the intellect. But on his way there, this does not trouble him. What he sees in it now is a glorious color, fervor, nevertheless, childlike innocence, joy of life, a mystical unity, a view justified by the millennial history of the Church. Living alone with him, the child had absorbed a little of any tradition. A few times they had gone to mass together. On one occasion, the child had even remarked that the people had been so good to her, but as a rule, they had been bored stiff at the very first sound and deeply offended by the mechanical, unfeeling demeanor of the false present-day priests and the equally evil, heartless, mindless voice of the false present-day faithful. Nevertheless, on his way along the railroad tracks, the man is convinced that the school at the sign of the saint will not be the right place for the child. He knows in advance that they will have to accept the child, that if there is no room for her, they will make room. It's a bright, cold morning in March. Behind a long, broad-branching cedar, a smoky, tumultuous sky, down in the chasm, the whistling, roaring of express trains, and cityward the river, with its seemingly frozen meanders glitting through the jumble of buildings, lies like a sleeping giant. The doubt quickens his step, as did the man approaching a decision according to the historian. Rings at the wrong door, is taken to the right one, and there, sure enough, with his more stuttered than spoken appeal, he's successful. The very next morning, the misery school on the other side of the tracks is abandoned forever, and the child, convinced by the adult's enthusiasm that she will be happy, slips willingly, even gratefully, into the new buildings. It was only a change of school, but for once it seemed a matter of life and death. The child finished out the year at the uh, denominational school and stayed on for the following year. It was not the school of schools that lay behind her. It had gone out of existence. But simplicity did the child good. The children came of different kinds of families, but were all from the immediate neighborhood and in this suburb, which at first seemed to merge undifferentiated with the surrounding communities, showed its individual, still rural character. And there was something uncommon about school, which, as it turned out, did the child a world of good. She surprised the adult by showing that it suited her to be common now and then. At first, the adult wanted to make her stop saying certain supposedly silly things, which, to make matters worse, she seemed to spout under remote control. But then he saw that the most idiotic jokes and the turns of phrase helped the child in the group games of which she had so long been deprived. And another thing he liked was that there was never the slightest indication of piety. Was the pious child even conceivable? All in all, the child's life in that period, in contrast to the preceding years, was shaped not so much by her hours in school as by the time spent at home, during most of which the adult was her only company. Often each was alone on a different floor. Someone who visited now and then remarked later that they had struck him at first as rather sad figures, and that it took him some time to notice that they were not unhappy at all, but actually quite cheerful and pleased with themselves. And the adult, too, reflected on a later day that he had never felt so close to perfect bliss at that time. But the great conflict of all these years in the foreign country became more and more pervasive, and the harmonious aspect of their life together did not enable him to think it away. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the adult began to feel at home in the foreign language. The child, however, who had quickly learned to handle it better than many native children, disliked speaking this second language. It became clear that so-called bilinguality was not an unmixed blessing, that in the long run it could lead to a painful split. At home with an adult, the child never used a foreign language. All day long in school, however, she heard not a single word of her own home language. When the adult saw her with native children out of school, he hardly knew his child. In speaking her foreign language, she put on a different voice, different gestures, and different facial expressions. The foreign manner of speaking brought with it a whole set of foreign marionette-like movements in which he discovered not just fear but panic. In any event, a release of tension was always evident when the child came home to her first language. Once again, she found her tongue, her body relaxed. She looked quietly around her. She herself told the adult how she had to get ready inside for the second language and in particular adjust her voice. During the school year, the conflict was often forgotten, but it turned to disaster at the end of vacation, which the adult was always spent in her own country. The misery of the return to the wilderness of the foreign signs and sounds was unparalleled, and of all foreign parts, there was none more glacial than this foreign language suburb. Her first days back made it plain to the adult that she would have to be taken to a place where her native language was spoken, and as soon as possible. And wasn't it reason enough to return home in 5 years in a foreign country she had not made friends with a single native child, but only with other foreign children, mostly from other continents and of different races. No more shailing. The child would return to the place of her first language. The decision had become possible because the adult only now saw the need for a change in his own life as well. Because the child, he had gradually forgotten his old ambition and sunk into a more and more pleasurable idleness. If he had a clear conscience, it was not only thanks to the child but also to the foreign surroundings in which no one asked him about his occupation. Here, in a manner of speaking, he was a licensed foreigner, which fell in his own existential ideal. There was no compelling need to work, since sufficient money remained from earlier exertions. On long walks through the many overlapping suburbs, a marvelous landscape spread out before him. Years later, he could have sketched a perfect map of those suburbs. Wasn't this the life? How would it be to undertake no new work, but just remain sequestered with a child in the clearing named abroad, sequestered in a foreign suburban house near the foreign school, hidden in the ups and downs of the admirable deserted suburban streets, from the high points of which the metropolis below could be seen to glitter in foreign new movements of eternity. Yes, yet this very pleasure in doing nothing led to such imperious visions of a larger, more peaceful, more generous plan of existence. The only good one that he came to long more and more urgently to do something persevering, something continuous that could be handed down. If not for my love of form, I would have become a mystic. The idler, often unnerved by solitude, had taken these words, spoken by a kindred spirit of the last century, as a guiding maxim. Yes, he too was becoming an ecstatic or visionary, contenting himself with pure contemplation. He must become master of his insights, and for that he would have to get back to work. He therefore decided to part with the child for a year. She would stay with her mother, who had never become an outsider, and would go to school in her own country, her birthplace, as this happened. The separation was no great blow to the child. What she needed now was her own language and friends. And the adult who had once despised those who gave up their normal everyday life for the sake of work went away, convinced that he had every right to do what he was doing. After 6 years almost uninterrupted along with the child, he was entitled to commit himself to the fullest, and that seemed possible, only if there was nothing to distract him. The day of parting comes at the end of summer, in a third country where they have spent their last weeks together. The child leaves first, heading in the renewed direction with their mother. The man stands on the airport balcony and sees the plane taking off. High in the sky, already very small, it loops northward. In the end, it is only a flashing light in an opening between clouds. At my feet, flagstones, still wet after a shower. Chapter 8. Ordinarily, the adults have looked upon children in general as an alien race, sometimes as a relentless, cruel enemy tribe that takes no prisoners, barbarous to the point of cannibalism, if not exactly hostile to humans, at least disloyal and useless, and in the long run, stupefying and dispiriting to one who had no other company but such utterly asocial hordes and mobs. From this recurrent estimation, he did not exclude his own offspring. But in the year of absence and work, which he spent almost exclusively traveling on different continents, children, with little effort on their part, became his great helpers. They are the strangers who greet him. They prevent his gaze from going too far and losing itself. In a moment of crisis, when such crisis endangered the necks, a child rang his doorbell, having stopped at the wrong floor, and the sight of the child was a disturbance just when needed. It inspired him, like the Everyman music, to carry on. In the late fall, while sitting on a bench in a hilly park, he watched a group of schoolchildren playing ball in a gully. One child remained apart from the game. He worked his way out of the group in larger and larger spirals, all the while looking around for someone. When the ball rolls toward him, he calmly moves out of the way. He stands for a while, swaying from side to side, then sits down on the bench, slides forward and backward, soundlessly opens his mouth, closes it, opens it again. He seems not only forlorn but also gentle and self-assured. His coat, which is too long for him, is buttoned up to his chin. A smoke like a viper arises from the mud and in the gully. A dancing of light on the children's hair. Late that winter, a bus ride through a mountain valley. The only other passengers are strangely quiet children on their way home from school. They alight singly or in small groups and vanish down the highway or on side roads. Earlier twilight, snow flurries, frozen waterfalls. Once through the open door of the bus, an exchange of sound between two birds, and in the cold outside, heartbreakingly sad, yet so beautiful that the listener wishes he could remember it forever and write music. The following spring, on a train trip through a dismal wet valley, he sees the child hop, skip, jumping along beside the tracks, and says to the child in his thoughts, "God bless you, hop, skip, jumping stranger." And then another bus ride, once again accompanied almost exclusively by children in the dusk and the darkness, and the involuntary words, "Can the children be saved?" For in the course of time, the traveler seems to have discovered that children, without exception, are deprived of something and also expect something. The babies he saw on planes, in waiting rooms, or elsewhere were not just cranky or restless. They screamed from the depths of their souls. In the most peaceful countryside, children bellowed for a member of their family, but apparently they also needed the random stranger who crossed their path. On crowded boulevards, in supermarkets, subway stations, time and time again, the adult found his own uncertainty in those wide-open, almost unblinking eyes at the level with the grown-up's waist, which took in every individual in the largest crowd on the lookout for a responsive glance. The passerby could count on their helpful notice. Then he realized that the modern times he had so often cursed and rejected did not exist, and that the end of time was also a figment of the brain. The same possibilities were reborn with every new consciousness, and the eyes of children in a crowd, just look at them, transmit the eternal spirit. Woe unto you who fail to see those eyes. One day he is in a museum looking at a painting of the massacre of the innocents. An infant in the snow raises its arms to its mother, a headscarf and apron. One of her legs is twisted back. Already the soldier, crooked index finger, is reaching out for the child. And as though all this were happening now, the beholder thinks, literally, this must not be, and resolved for his part to embark on a different tradition. On one Sunday afternoon in early summer, on his deliberately circuitous return journey, he is on a steamer crossing a large lake, already in his own language zone. The much invoked community had long of that he was now certain ceased to exist. Those who had fostered the beauty of the country were long dead, and most of the living population glowered and sulked because there was no war. From all the walnuts on the streets, such was his curse. Let sharp knives fall on those unfruitful people down in the shade and wipe them out. But on that particular day, a man in a black suit and an open white shirt sat across from him on deck. Beside him, a child, dressed in pretty much the same way. It's unusual for the two to be together like this. The man is employed on some large construction project and seldom sees his child. They're from a region where there are neither lakes nor ships, but they are not tourists from a far country. They are natives on an excursion. This may be the first time they have gone anywhere together, and in any case, it is only for this Sunday afternoon. They don't seem especially joyful. They sit together and very straight, attentive, and wide awake. The air is clear. The shore seems hardly a stone's throw away. Chains of hills cloaked in a conifer brown. Man and child sit with their hands on their knees. From time to time, the child asks a question. Not a childlike voice. The man answers in monosyllables, but with thoroughness. Not a trace of the sugary tone with which adults so often talk to child. Some going so far as to affect a sort of a baby talk. The trip takes all afternoon, zigzagging back and forth across the lake from landing to landing. The unknown man's face is more and more shaded. The child is as grave as ever. They're still sitting at the same distance from each other, forming a dark group of their own, the only one on the boat. The immense sorrow, but also dignity and ability. For the first time, the observer sees their blackness as a color and recognizes it to be the color of a people. He has never seen two human beings closer to heaven. Heaven, that is, no longer seems so very far away from them. Behind the chain of hills, a wall of thunderous clouds, and the treetops on the crest show a bright border, not a mere glow, but something substantial, out of which ocean waves raised by the wind squalls roll one after another to the horizon, heralding the target age, the age of humanity, eternity. In the dusk, the two will leave the ship and walk through the town to the bus station. Folding doors will open and the clouds of dust will blow across a deserted field. With the first raindrops, balls of dust will form. All night long, the bus will stand empty out in the country somewhere, in a village named Galicia, ready for the return trip to the city in the gray of dawn. Foggy day of arrival in the late fall, only the returnee is real. Without him, the child has become more robust. Now she is able to defend herself and can't see why in the past she never put up a fight. But she remains as vulnerable as ever, with a tendency to stand aside, as if she didn't belong. The many changes of place haven't impaired her orientation. She even knows the direction of the North Pole and the South Pole from the house where she lives. She has taken on very little of the local accent, but a few grown-up expressions have turned up in her speech, and the adult is inclined to ask her, "Are you still a child, or have you become a German?" Her playmate, however, is not a local child, but hails from a good old foreign country, and the kinship between them is such that one can phone the other on account of a cloud. She listens to the same songs, popular and folk, which gave the man his first notions of charm and freedom. Worrisome, perhaps, how often, when alone, she spends her time moving absently from TV to cassette player and back. But the doubt commands himself to be trusting. Here again, he recognizes order behind the confusion and is able, sometimes at least, to refrain from interfering. At times he surprises himself a novel impulse to educate, though the only thing he could teach her springs from the innermost language of the "I am the strongest of all." But to be heard by the child, one would have to be much more succinct, and so the child remains the teacher, for she teaches him to have more time for the colors of the world outside, to see forms more accurately, and therefore to read the changes of the season in an uncurled fern, in the leatheriness of a leaf, or the new rains on a snail shell. From her, he too from her too, he learns the truth about the essence of beauty. Beauty is so hard to see. At times, she really had magical powers. The man she has learned that from the year of absence. Her modesty conceals demonic capabilities and skills, and one day, as she is exercising them, the adult for the first time smells something resembling sweat on the child's body, the sweet, fruitful sweat of creativeness. One afternoon, he sees her going about the city alone, seen by no one but taking it all in, like the caliph found in the legend. And then he sees the other comparable vagrants savoring the joys of invisibility, the secret sovereign of all markets, streets, and back alleys. At the same time, of course, actions bring home to him the need for regularity in her upbringing. No malice or wickedness, something more like a negligence or indifference to others, which is infuriating as only lawlessness can be. The adult once heard a man address the following diatribe to his own son: "Disgrace to your parents, a lickspittle, unfeeling simpleton, slave to your passions, monster of ingratitude, golden calf to yourself, great saltpeter of ruthlessness, source of all my bitterness, monument of selfishness, heartless tyrant, prodigy of sloth, temple of laziness, seat of every vice, epitome of aimlessness, wolf in sleep's clothing, preventer of greatness and goodness, my closet kin and worst enemy, cause and content of my nightmares, incurable wound in my bosom, model of smugness, incapacity for sympathy, captiousness, and philistinism. It's all over between us. I never want to hear of you again. Never again shall your name be uttered in this house. Begone." And the boy, addressed with such biblical clarity, understood. He went pale and hadn't a word to say to himself. The witness thought he would take this litany as an example, but whenever he attempted anything of the kind, he failed to summon up the passion that had given the prototype the voice of a thunder god. The next time he emits soundless shouts, he notices in mid-harangue that his victim has been waiting the whole time for a glance, that she is not standing in front of him or opposite, but below him. The following spring, the child turned 10. She enjoyed her birthday and accepted congratulations with self-possession. After that, she spent whole days without grown-ups and managed by herself or without children. In a forest which she now passes through on her way to school, almost all the birdhouses have swastikas daubed on them. No one seems to notice them. But when the adult mentions the swastikas to the child, she knows all the bad places During the following winter, when the leaves had half concealed the birdhouses have fallen, the sight becomes intolerable. The doubt suggests that they go together and paint out the malignant symbols. At first, he himself found the idea rather extravagant, but to his surprise, a child is all over in favor, and they spend the whole morning among the trees with pen and brush, a trifling action, shouts of approval, darkly flashing avenger eyes. The spring after that, on a windy Sunday, unusually mild for the altitude, the child is standing on a sandy front yard. The grounds on a slight incline are bordered by a row of bushes. Deep black gaps open in the bushes in rhythm with the air flying in the foreground, was very much like this time almost 10 years earlier when the child wandered off alone to the bank of the foreign river. Now she is moving through those gaps while everything blows wildly about her, moving as though to the end of the world. Never should such moments pass or be forgotten. The demand more time and space in which to pulse it, a melody, song. On a rainy morning the following autumn, the adult is taking the child part of the way to school. Over the years, her school bag has become so heavy that its bearer has been nicknamed the school slave. Other school children come along, and the child continues on with them. The wet dark and leads to a road leads to a cluster of new houses. In front of them, the steady swinging of the planetary crowns. The bright parts of the picture are the balcony railings and the flashing window squares at the end of the street. And in the foreground, the metal clocks and the nameplates and the bags on the backs of the walking children. Now the two continue to form a single, one and only flaming, one catching inscription that remains to be deciphered now. And often later, the eyewitness ponders the words of the poet, which should apply to every story about the child, and not only in written ones. Cantalina, perpetuating the plenitude of love and all passionate happiness.